All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Niraj Kumar. I'm lead cloud architect. I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer, and we have been conducting Azure Talk online session for a while, and we have conducted more than 28 sessions in total. And we are, this series we are covering DevOps. So this is the second session that we are having. The first session, if you missed it, you can always refer our past sessions, by visiting to website cloudez.com/azuretalk.html. There you will find all our previous recorded sessions, and you can refer those. So this is a continuation of our existing journey that we are undergoing through DevOps, and we'll have multiple sessions on DevOps. DevOps is a really important topic, and it's a very everybody wants to understand how DevOps is, and DevOps is a big buzzword. So we are trying to demystify it, and trying to break it down in pieces so that it's easy to understand. And in the continuation of the same session, today we are going to talk about Azure infrastructure as a code, or rather infrastructure as a code, and we will apply that principle. We will into Azure. Azure is our focus. But you can apply infrastructure as a code concept anywhere and everywhere, which is in public cloud or on-premise, anywhere. Today, I'm joined by Ashish Raj, who is a senior DevOps engineer with Cyber Group Incorporation, and he's one of the DevOps enthusiasts, and I truly, admire him for all his ability and the contribution that he's doing for Azure Talk and Azure community in general. I'm also joined by Deepak Singh Thami, who is PowerShell MVP, Microsoft Valuable Professional. So he's very active and ardent, a follower when it comes to PowerShell, and he brings in a load of expertise in terms of automation. And he works with Dell EMC, and all his contact information are listed out there, which you can reach out to them. Just for housekeeping purpose, I have muted all the participants. In case if you have any question, you can type in the chat. We want to make sure that we maintain the quality of this recording because we record these sessions. In case you want to speak up, if you have any question, you can type that in chat, and if you really want to speak up, I can unmute yourself if you type in the chat. So with that, I will get into the agenda. What are we going to cover today? So we are going to cover about DevOps. As I said, this is the second session. So our whole and sole focus will be today is infrastructure as a code. So we'll define what is infrastructure as a code and how it can be used, how it can be leveraged within enterprise, and what are the benefits, what's the use that you have, and what are the benefits that you can derive out of infrastructure as a code. We'll talk about infrastructure as a code tool system, a tool ecosystem. What are different tools that are available, which an IT professionals or an organization can leverage to make IaC possible or a possibility. We'll also talk about infrastructure as a code tool pipeline, wherein you have the complete pipeline starting from the developer and going up to the production. We'll talk about Azure Resource Manager, which is the component of Microsoft which makes it possible to create a declarative template for you, and you can deploy your infrastructure as a code in Azure. Then finally, we will drill down further where Ashish and Deepak will help us demystifying what is ARM template, Azure Resource Manager template, what is the structure, how does it look like, and how do you basically deploy that in Azure. And then finally, we will have a demo where we will, using ARM template, we will deploy a virtual network, and we'll deploy multiple subnets inside that. We'll deploy NSG, and then finally, we'll also deploy a virtual machine. And we'll have ample opportunity for question and answer once we are done with the PowerPoint, the slides, and during the session also, during the demo also, you can ask those questions, and we will take those questions. So that's in a nutshell the agenda. With that, I'll move on to the actual content. So let's define what is infrastructure as a code, right? So infrastructure as code, or also in short, we call it IaC. Infrastructure as code, or IaC is basically, it gives you a power. It gives you the ability to provision your resources in identical copies. So when I say identical copies, if you have repeatable infrastructure, you want the same infrastructure again and again. You have defined patterns. If you have defined architecture patterns, if you have defined deployment patterns, you have identified some 10 deployment patterns which every time your developers require, and you need to deploy that. Today, if you do it, how do you do it? You go and request that resources from your engineering team, your operations team, and build team. They will take that and build it for you. And every time they have to do it. Whereas if you know that most of the time, 80% of the time, you will realize that there are some 10 chosen deployment pattern or architecture pattern is what's used by a lot of developers. If you can identify those commonly used deployment patterns, you can take benefit of infrastructure as a code, and you can code that architecture pattern in JSON template or in infrastructure as a code format, which can be deployed multiple times without any human error or human intervention. So it's truly makes it possible to make it error-free deployment, and it will be very fast to provision, and also you can deprovision it if you don't need it. So that way you will save money, and you will also be able to make sure that there is no error at all, and it's a repeatable deployment. So it gives you an ability to provision your resources in a predictable way, right? So that's what it is. That's in a nutshell what is infrastructure as a code, and you can repeat it time and again. You don't have to really wait for a person. You don't have to, and in fact you can also move this IaC into self-service model, where end user can choose from architecture catalog, some pre-approved architecture catalog, and they just say I need architecture pattern 1 or 2. You select that, and you will have option, and you can allow the users to deploy in a resource group inside in Azure. So that is infrastructure as a code. Then you have what makes it possible, like behind the infrastructure as a code is declarative declarative code, what makes it possible. So there are many industry leading declarative code format that you can use, but mainly it is JSON, which is Java service object notation notation format. Another is YAML, which is used by Google Cloud, and JSON is using that you can deploy, or you can use infrastructure as code for Azure and AWS. GCP uses YAML. In case of AWS, you can use both JSON and YAML. But Microsoft Cloud, and since we are sticking to Microsoft Cloud, in Azure you will use JSON template, and you will see when Deepak and Ashish will give you demo, will walk through the JSON template. So in a nutshell, you have infrastructure as a code, and then you have set of tools which makes it possible, and why you will need infrastructure as a code. The benefits, there are numerous benefits which we'll talk about in our next session also. In addition to using declarative code, it also provides you an ability to put in a version control. So this is the beauty of infrastructure as a code. Today, if you talk about a version control is only restricted to software development environment. That's where we see that, right? As if you're a developer, if you develop any application, any software, and if you really want to, version control is there, everybody's aware who is a developer. But as an infrastructure person, as an IT ops or an IT pro, you wouldn't really think or relate yourself with the version control. But with infrastructure as a code, you can have version control of your infrastructure itself. You can take that to that level where you can say that I have architecture pattern 1 version 1, version 2, version 3, version 4, which one you want. You can your user can select that version, and each version will have minor or major changes depending on how you do it. So now the entire infrastructure can be version controlled the same way as you do with the software. So that's the beauty of infrastructure as a code, and it is going way forward. This is the way to maintain your infrastructure and the configuration of your infrastructure. So that is that's the benefit, and that's what it is, IaC. Deepak and Ashish, you want to add something?
Yep. Okay. So in a nutshell, infrastructure as code is basically a discipline or an approach where you take your infrastructure automation code, which could be like scripts in Python or PowerShell, and applying some of the practices which the software development world has been um, following for a long time, like version control, testing, right? Automated deployments, continuous delivery pipelines. So all the good things which those guys have learned in few decades. What we are trying to do with this discipline is adopt some of the best practices when it comes to treating infrastructure or managing servers in the cloud.
All right. Thank you, Deepak. All right. So let's move on to the next slide. So what is infrastructure as a code? So infrastructure as a code, as I explained earlier, and this is a graphics which I borrowed from TechNet article from Microsoft. So the infrastructure as a code is where you will define your your infrastructure. Your infrastructure could be, it can consist of a series of components or set of components. Like for example, you can have web servers, and you can have one of the pattern could be that you have three web servers, and then you have the backend as the database server. This could be one architecture pattern. There could be a second architecture pattern where you have web server, an app server, and then DB server. That's second architecture pattern. And you can basically come up with your own architecture pattern, which is commonly used within your organization. And those there are some generic patterns that you can use, like 3-tier architecture, 2-tier architecture, and there are some specific architecture patterns which you can develop, which is specific for your organization, and you can decide that. Once you have identified your architecture, which you're really going to transition into infrastructure as a code, you will start that using the coding it. So what do you mean by coding? As Deepak said, we can put in using the automation tool and the scripting. So the languages that we use, the JSON language, right? So JSON is what will give you the ability to code your infrastructure. So now you can have a declarative template which defines the infrastructure. It doesn't say how. It doesn't include the configuration information. It just includes the declaration. It just includes declarative information about what it should be. What should be the instead. It doesn't include how to reach that instead. REST system will take care. It masks, the underlying complexity from you. So you have identified your architecture pattern. Then you use JSON script to define those architecture pattern, and then you can continuously deploy it. And you can have a use cases where, remember, our complete life cycle goes, your application development life cycle goes from dev to QA. Then QA to UAT, and then from UAT onward to prod, right? So you will need the same infrastructure in all these four environments. Now, sorry. So you will need the same infrastructure in all the environment, right? Now, if you have to really do it in the real world today, if you have to do it, what you'll do, you will open a service request ticket with your build and provisioning team. They will build your dev environment, then they will build your QA environment, then they will UAT, and finally prod. Remember, if you need a truly tried and tested environment, all this environment has to be exactly the same. That's when you can move the code and you can be sure that this is exactly, it's working the way it is working. Or you can also have slight variation in your dev and QA, UAT, and prod environment. But this requires manual intervention, whereas if you use infrastructure as code, you can define your infrastructure for this environment into specific declarative template, which is JSON template. And from there on, you can just take it and deploy it in your Azure subscription or any cloud for that matter. So the key over here is the picture that I wanted to depict here is you need to identify your deployment pattern. You need to identify your architecture pattern. And once you have identified that, work your way to really codify it into a JSON format or any of the declarative format that you want to use. And then finally take that and either it's up to you whether you want to make it self-service for end user, or you want your build you want to empower your build and provisioning team to take that and deploy into the different environment that you have. Anything that you want to add, Ashish or Deepak?
Nope.
All right.
You're good.
Yeah, so as you have explained everything, so that is what infrastructure as code is. You will use all the tools what developers has been using, so that you can utilize and you can help. Actually, you can supplement the DevOps and in the way of leading to agile implementation in your organization. So yeah, we can move it to the next slide.
All right, thank you, Ashish. All right, so these are some of the benefits of infrastructure as a code, and I will need much more help from Ashish and Deepak to elaborate on that. But these are some of the benefits why an organization should adopt infrastructure as a code. These are some of the tangible benefits which is going to accrue if you do that, right? So some of the benefits, as I have already talked about, declarative format, which is like you don't really specify how to get there. You just say that this is the end state I want to. The system will take care of making sure that the system always maintains that end state. You don't have to really specify how to reach that end state. So that's why it is declarative template. Then you have self-documented system. Since this is infrastructure as a code, that means you already have a documentation which can really clearly define what is there in your infrastructure, and it's really self-explanatory if you really read the JSON template. So this is self-document. That's one of the benefits. Version control we talked about. You can have your infrastructure version control, so you can have infrastructure version 1, version 2, version 3, version 4, and if you really want to go back in the time, you can go forward and go back. You can really do that with this infrastructure as a code to fix any problem or to really find a root cause analysis if you really want to do that. Infrastructure as a code gives you immutable infrastructure if you really want to do that. I know a lot of organization is gearing and trying to get towards that. Immutable infrastructure means that you don't have to log on to the server, and Deepak also explained it in previous session, where it means every configuration that you have to do on the server, you don't have to RDP at all. You will use the declarative template or configuration as a code or infrastructure as a code to make those changes. You will never log in at all. Everything will be centrally controlled, version controlled, and that infrastructure is truly immutable. Nobody's logging on to it, nobody's doing anything. It's just you're using your tools of the PowerShell DAC, or you're using Ansible, or you're using Terraform, anything in it, or you're using Chef or Puppet to make sure that there's no configuration drift. So that gives you truly the ability to immutable infrastructure. And then you have other benefits where you can continuously test your system. If you want to make any changes, you will be making changes in smaller bits and pieces, but not the entire. And you will have, for each change, you can have a version of your minor and major version of your infrastructure's code. And finally, as I said, this goes in the spirit of our agile methodology and DevOps, which brings in agile and DevOps all together, and which all the industry, right now we're talking about going agile, and we want to be more productive. So this is in a nutshell the benefits of infrastructure as code. So Ashish or Deepak, you want to add on, elaborate on these points? Ashish?
Ashish?
I think you have covered, most of it. So uses declarative files. As it says, And as you have covered that, when you use infrastructure as code, you choose a scripting technology like JSON or YML, which declare, which actually uses a very simple language to code. The first thing, and the second thing is it will be declarative. So declarative means that the people who has been using PowerShell, they know that even though PowerShell automate things, but they have to write a script which does, they have to write a script where they have to do all the conditional loop things, all the error handling, everything they have to do. It's just that they have written in a code. But what declarative files means that, what are the benefits you will get with JSON or YML or application like, Chef or Puppet, that you will just give the end result. Like you need a particular port open. How to open that port, that will be taken care by that particular engine. So if we talk about ARM template, so that will be taken care by the Azure Resource Manager itself. If we talk about Terraform, then that will be taken care of, by the engine of Terraform itself. So it's kind of, you will just give a desired state. That is another concept within infrastructure as code, and the rest of the things, how to achieve that, what are the things it will need to enable or disable, to uninstall or reinstall things in the system, that will be taken care by the engine itself. You don't have to write, logic and error handling and all those things. So in nutshell, declarative files has made easy your job if you are already doing automation, and if you are just new to the automation. So if you are into the, if you have already been into the automation where you used to write a long script of PowerShell to, to create a VM in Azure, in classic model, now ARM came and then it gives you the JSON template where you don't have to write all of it, creating storage account and then, creating the configuration for virtual machine and then also and so. You just have to declare it in an ARM template and things will be taken care by the Azure Resource Manager. Now, the self-documented system and processes, what actually it means that since you are, declaring everything and it is a very easy to understand language, you no longer have to actually, have a place for knowledge management. In legacy system, we know that we used to have a knowledge management team, all together where they're supposed to write the procedures and how to achieve a particular thing and document everything and then versioning the document. But since you are actually creating infrastructure using code, so the things you are doing are already documented. You just have to follow a standard. You just have to follow a coding standard, I would say, the design pattern and things like that, so that the other person, whosoever is responsible for managing that infrastructure, will be able to see that code. And since it is easy to understand, JSON, YML, these are all are being, being picked by major or most of the industry leaders in infrastructure as code ecosystem, because they are easy to understand, they are easy to transition. So, the other person will be able to understand what the infrastructure current state is and what things, what the changes are required, as per the request or maybe as per the architecture update or something, and they don't need a separate document to follow. So that's what it means, the self-documented system and then self-documented process itself. Then if you have applied continuous integration and continuous delivery concept as well into your infrastructure as code. So we will talk about that in the later slide. What are the tool sets available? We have a few of the tool sets we will be talking about. Few of the tool set, there are so many tools who helps you doing things what you consider DevOps as a culture. So we will be talking about few of the things, how you can have a process which is self-documented. as Niraj and Deepak has already covered that version control. So since you are into a space now where you will supposed to write codes, it's no more manual stuff now,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
So you are not doing something manual, having a screenshot, then documenting it in a Word file or PDF, and then storing it for another knowledge transfer session. This is not how it works. Now you will code everything. The code will, where the code will reside, the code should reside on a version control system, so
Correct.
that it should be available centrally. So anyone from your team.
That's a good that's a good point that you brought up, like your code, and we'll talk about the different tools which you use. So code control or the version control is very important. Now it's all documented and you store it in central repository. So that's a very good point. Thank you, Ashish, for adding on to it. So with that, let's move on to the next slide.
Okay.
All right, so this is a very important slide that we have put forward, where what we are trying to do is we are trying to depict the infrastructure as a code pipeline, or the tool sets that the ecosystem that comes in infrastructure as a code. And we'll spend a little bit time more on this so that you are aware what are the different tools which are available for us to use, and as what really makes it possible on the ground, because without these tool sets you will not be able to really leverage any of or you will not be able to really make it possible. And these are not by any mean a complete tool set. There's so many tool set, but what we have picked up, we picked some really popular one, the one which is used by enterprise in general, and plus also used by open community. But there's so many tools, and you are just restricted by your imagination. But what we are trying to do here is we are trying to depict the tool sets that basically most of the organization or most of the enterprise are leveraging today. So to begin with, you can navigate this stack from from up to down, or from down in bottom up, or the way. But your infrastructure as a code journey, probably it will start from the top, where you have different platforms. So like you have probably a Docker engine that you have, or the Docker infrastructure that you have built for your on-prem, or you could have your private cloud, which is Azure Stack, that could be sitting on-prem. That these are the platforms where you will deploy your infrastructure. You could have your Azure. So Azure is your public cloud. That's where you will host your applications, or you'll host your infrastructure. You could have your own private cloud. Obviously Azure Stack also gives you truly hybrid cloud, but then you can also have your own private cloud. For example, VMware or OpenStack or Hyper-V. There also, some of the tools supports, like for example, you can use Terraform. Terraform can deploy the solution across. It's cloud agnostic. It can deploy in Azure, it can deploy in AWS, it can deploy on-prem, it can deploy in any other provider, and it supports many resource providers. Then you have Google Cloud. So these are the platform. Then finally you have AWS. So like you can, using this tool, you can deploy your platform into there. So this is the platform that's that's the top that you have sitting here. Now when you come as a developer, as an infrastructure developer, I mean, we are infrastructure as a code guy, we are IT pros guy, so we can't call you a developer, but assuming that you're an infrastructure developer, and you have infrastructure knowledge at the same time, you know more than automation. You really not into really coding and application development, but you know automation and a little bit more than that. So you're a little guy over here who is an infrastructure developer, trying to code and trying to navigate and trying to make infrastructure as a code a reality. So what do you need? The first thing that you'll start is you need to code, right? So you need different tools. So Microsoft and other third-party vendors offers you different code editing tools that you can use as as infrastructure developer. So you can use ArmVig, which is visualizing a way to Azure Resource Manager, so armvig.io, and I have we'll go through a couple of tools demo. For example, we look at ARM Vision, see how we can visualize the ARM template. So that's one code editor that you can use. You can use Notepad Plus. I know many people have used it. It does support many other stuff, in addition to JSON, but you can use Notepad. Then Microsoft also has, this is again in preview, it's called Azure Resource Explorer. This is still in preview, but you can really visualize, you can really see. So whatever resources you have provisioned in Azure, and if you go and log into Azure Resource Explorer, which is resource.azure.com, you will be able to see the JSON of each of your deployments. So you can, let's say you already have a deployment, you can go into there and you can copy those JSON and repeat it. You can use that. You don't have to write your JSON script from scratch, and we can see that. Then you have Visual Studio. I think it's a favorite tool of all the developers, so you know about what I'm talking about. So you can use Visual Studio to even code your PowerShell or JSON or any other thing. Then Microsoft has an open source tool called Visual Studio Code. This is the one which I think Ashish and all of us use, especially in the infrastructure as a code or DevOps community, especially for writing a script and JSON. We use a lot. It's open source. It's free of cost. Anybody can download Visual Studio Code. And then finally you have PowerShell. So you can, again, it's free of charge. So you can have Azure. PowerShell has different modules for different resources. So including Azure resources, you have within Azure itself, you have 72 plus services. For each services, they have PowerShell module, and you can really explore that. So that's a code portion. Then we move up one in the stack. So you come into the language, tool, and framework, right? So that's where the different, depending on what which level you're comfortable with, you will choose those formats. So you have JSON, we talked about. So Java Service Object Notation. YAML is missing here, but JSON and YAML you can consider. These are the two declarative format that you can use. That's for infrastructure as code. You can use Terraform, which is tool which makes it possible to write code one and multi-cloud deployment. Basically, let's say if I want to deploy a piece of infrastructure. So for example, I want to deploy web app in Azure, and I want to deploy my big data infrastructure in Google Cloud, and this will be a multi-cloud solution. I cannot do that using Microsoft ARM template, because ARM template is only restricted to Azure Resource Manager. So in that case, you need a tool which is cloud agnostic. So you can use Terraform. So Terraform will let you write one code which can interact with multiple cloud providers, and it can provision it across the cloud. You have Ansible, which is another open source tool, which people are a lot of favorite tool, which is there, which people use it. So again, it provides you cloud agnostic solution for automating your infrastructure. Then you have these three. You have something called configuration as a code or desired state configuration. So you can use Chef, and there are many other tools. We just try, as I said, we try to keep our focus to some of the popular tools. So Chef is your where you can automate your configuration management. So once you've deployed the infrastructure, then making changes inside operating system, making sure certain application is installed and your configuration is maintained. All those you can do using Chef or Puppet. These are two tools. Plus Microsoft also has PowerShell desired state configuration, which is part of Azure